E-commerce is nothing new, but 2020 was a massive shakeup across industries. Suddenly, we couldn't even go to the physical stores. We started buying more and more from our computers, from our phones, and we started to like it too. E-commerce total global share of retail rose from 13% in 2019 to 20% in 2020, according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. The rules of the game have changed. So how is the organization to adapt to this rise of the digital consumer? To tell us more about this rise, we have the pleasure to be joined by Nevine El-Warraky, Managing Director, Goods, Consumer Goods Lead Europe for Accenture Interactive. Hello, Nevine.
Hello, Helen. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Nevine is joining us from London, and so we are looking forward to listening to you and to give us all the keys about the rise of this digital consumer. Go ahead.
Thank you. So as Helena said, digital consumer and the way we've been engaging with goods and services online has changed fundamentally. And this doesn't just affect one industry, it affects everybody in a way that we haven't experienced in the past. So people have obviously gone through massive changes over the last year, a massive transformation in the way they live and what's important for them. Accenture normally runs this research annually about the change in consumer habits and how they live their lives. And the research that was done this year has been really interesting because people told us that they have fundamentally changed the way they evaluate their lives. I really like that quote on the left-hand side. It says, "The pandemic made me really revise my personal purpose and what's important to me in life." And as you can see in the graph, we've got a group of global consumers. This research was done in 25 countries, and 50% of all consumers told us that they're reimagining their lives. They're thinking about what's important, but they're also evaluating their purchase motivations for various types of goods and services, whether it's banking or consumer goods or retail. They're thinking what's important to them. 33% were also heading in that direction, with only 17% of consumers that we've called traditional, who still think that life will go back to exactly the same way it was when the pandemic is over, when at least it becomes a bit more of a everyday occurrence like a cold. I think what we see from the research is that the move to digital and digital commerce and digital experiences has significantly gone up in a way that we haven't seen in the past. And importantly, we don't think it's going to change going forward. So I like the statement. I want to get what I want, when I want, where I want. And the almost 170% increase in digital purchases have come from new people and come from people that are fundamentally changing the way they live and the way they engage. And I think it's important to think how, as brand owners and service owners, we're going to engage with them in the future. So what that means, it means that there's no going back. Consumer behavior has changed forever. And when I say consumer, I mean consumer and customer. We're all consumers of, whether it's products or services. There is no turning back. It's going to change forever. And we need to think about how we're going to, cater to that new set of expectations. And it represents a certain set of challenges for most businesses and organizations. When the pandemic first hit, everybody went into a little bit of a panic mode. How do we do this going forward? How do we respond? How do we make sure that our brands and services are still critical? And I think, obviously, the panic has subsided. A lot of organizations have responded and responded well, and are now resetting for a different type of future going forward in this new digital age, if you want. The first set of challenges they have faced are around engagement models. I know that most of you know that it's been a very long time since we moved from the broadcast model of the past, whereby you're putting maybe advertising out on television and it's just one-way communication. But you'd be surprised that even in this digital age, with the availability of digital engagement channels, there's still a lot that's one way. A lot of communication that's being put out there, but there is not an engagement in a two-way dialogue. And I think if you are competing with digitally native brands that have born, in the digital environment, you're missing out, because most of these brands are have got a relationship with the consumers and their customers. They know what they want. They understand how they're sort of dealing with it, and are able to respond quickly. I sometimes use the example of Glossier, which is a makeup brand, was born sort of through a blogger, launched her business, worth a lot of money now, limited range, but the ability to sort of connect with the consumer at this level is unparalleled. And I think if you're L'Oreal and you're engaging, that's the type of digitally native brand, for example, that you're having to think about, as well as the normal competitors. And I'm just using L'Oreal as an example. I know they do brilliant stuff. The second issue, which I think you're probably going to hear about throughout this, is around the digital shelves being up for grabs. Maybe it feels like it's specific to consumer goods, but I really genuinely don't think it is. If you are buying your product or your service through a physical channel in the past, you knew which aisle you're walking down. You knew exactly what you're looking for. So, for example, if you're buying pet food, you're walking down an aisle that sells pet food. So your selection is limited and you're being guided to a shopping experience. When the digital shelf became the only shelf for quite long periods of time, you ended up in a situation where if you type, canned meat, for example, in a search, you can get pet food, you can get human food, you can get all sorts of things. So understanding how, as a brand, you're going to show up online and how you're going to engage online and how you're going to continue to build that relationship with your consumer online is going to be important. And even more important is how you're going to get the feedback you're going to get through the data loop back into your system, so you're able to respond to it on a regular basis. The same is true for things like banking. I know we talk about products and brands and consumers, but in reality, services that were provided online, during the pandemic, during the various lockdowns, were amazing, and the level of expectation from your customers have become exactly the same. So people want to be able to have that level of service, personal care, engagement digitally in the same way that the people stood up their services post-pandemic. So the digital space is genuinely vast, confusing, and I think brands need to think about how they'll act differently in that space. The third thing I'm going to talk about is that the business models themselves are being disrupted. I'm sure you have heard and you'll hear a lot of people talking about the rise of marketplaces as a key channel where people are engaging. Obviously, Amazon's been around for a long time, but it's not just Amazon. You've got the Sephora.com, you've got a lot of retailers. E-tailing is a big thing, and marketplaces are a big thing. And the business models for brands and services being part of that marketplace are different, and how money is made is different. And therefore, thinking about the existing business models, understanding the profit pools. In the past, marketplaces often made money from the consumer. I think increasingly, retailers are also reinventing themselves, and the money is being made, through the manufacturer. Important to think about the retail experience as well, and think about what the new business model looks like to be able to compete with the rise of the digital consumer, how the experience in store might be able to complement the digital experience so that the consumer and the customer feel served in exactly the same way throughout. And defining the new value pathways is going to be really important going forward. And then lastly, but not least, critically, I think most big organizations are relatively siloed in terms of their functional and operating model setup. So you've got marketing, you've got sales, you've got commerce. Sometimes you sort of think, does that go into sales? Does that go into marketing? Where does it sit? And innovation and all that sort of stuff working together means that the old traditional setups inside an organization need to evolve to be able to accommodate the change in the environment we're seeing. Really quite importantly, because at the moment they can potentially get in the way with lack of clarity around responsibility and therefore speed being hampered along the way. So we just really need to think about how this changes going forward. Equally, we're seeing a lot of companies start to respond and adapt. I talked earlier about digital natives, and obviously in this environment, they have a slight unfair advantage. So if you were born digital, you already have this first-party data, you're able to engage with your consumer or customer firsthand, you're able to have that dialogue I talked about earlier. And I'm going to share a couple of interesting examples of how people are doing it. But even the bigger organizations are now starting to explore ways of how they can not just build that because they've experimented with it, but how they can systemize it going forward. Just a couple of examples that I found interesting when I was looking at this presentation. Thinking about social commerce, how a social commerce journey starts. We don't have many social selling channels yet in Europe. Very prevalent in Asia, obviously, particularly in China. But we can see that it's starting to pop up in lots of places in Europe and in the US. And I think we need to really think about how we use that. So Very Shop have launched this shop party feature, which is fantastic. It allows you and your friends, and you can see in the example visually here, we've used a sort of a, not quite a teenage girl, but maybe in her 20s. And the idea is that to invite your girlfriends virtually, and you can see each other's shopping carts, you can give each other advice. So it's the equivalent of being on FaceTime or something, as well as being inside the shop, and having the conversation around the items, maybe styling them. It allows you just to create this idea of a party. It's almost like the very old-fashioned, Tupperware party we had in the past, where people gathered in a physical space and looked at the products. This is the equivalent, except it's digital. We genuinely think this is going to increase, but fantastic example. The other example I really liked, because it's a bigger brand, much bigger brand, is Tiger Beer Malaysia. And I like this example because they created a virtual street food festival in last October when most of the world was more or less in lockdown. And in that street festival, it can be as physical as you possibly could be without actually being there. So you can create your own avatar, you can experience different stalls, and you order your brands from them, they get delivered to you. You can then play games with the people. You can walk down, obviously, this virtual environment, and then the physical products themselves get delivered pretty quickly. So it was like a full experience and a genuine attempt to merge this digital, amazing, fun environment with the actual physical products being smoothly delivered to you in the right format. I really like it, and I think several brands have experimented with that type of virtual environment. And then last but not least, a sort of a much more local type of initiative with the Modern Milkman. So I don't know about in Spain, but I think we still have very much in the UK, the milkman in some places delivering the fresh milk very early in the morning and leaving it outside of the doorstep. And this is a Modern Milkman, very small company. And during the pandemic, they really increased their services to supply dairy products, bread, juices, vegetables, eggs, tea and coffee, everything that the household needed. Because we had lockdown, we had all the shops closed, but they managed to establish, again, this relationship with their customers and managed to get this 5 million funding from an environmentally based investment fund. They're servicing their neighborhoods, it's local, it's community, it's environmentally friendly because the consumption of energy is considerably lowered. And I think post-pandemic, people want that personal relationship is becoming much, much more important. So these are the sort of challenges the people are facing. However, a lot of companies have piloted little things in isolation, and we just feel that with the pace of change that we're now experiencing, it's important that we think much more about holistic innovation and reinvention rather than just the individual smaller pilots that people have been looking at in the past. I just think the pace of change will continue, and I think it's important that we think about how we're going to cope with that. So there are three things that we are suggesting that our clients think about, and I'm going to talk about each one of them. One is around how do you have this two-way dialogue with your consumer, particularly when you don't have access to first-party data. How do you do this in a meaningful way that is actually systemized and manageable? The second thing is around the business models, and the third one is around the operating model. So if I go back to talk about the dialogue, think about what your purpose is as a brand, obviously, always a starting point, and then think about how you create this two-way dialogue with consumer. What channels will you use? How will you gather the data? How will you make it work? Do you know how their purchase motivations have changed? Reacquaint yourself with the customer and the consumer. think about how their needs have changed. I talked at the beginning about this research we've done that said that people have reevaluated their own purpose, and that means that they've reevaluated the brands they're interacting with and how they might consume it differently. So think about that. Think about genuinely understanding what's changed, get to know them again, understand how you can create this type of relationship through an online experience. And at the same time, think about the data that you're going to be able to hopefully gather through that interaction, and think about how it will be used to refine the experience, engage better with the consumer. So the idea of a dialogue with the consumer and the customer is absolutely critical. I mean, for consumer goods companies, and obviously they're not the only people we're talking about, this provides an opportunity because in the past, first-party data always resided with the retailers. For the retailer, this is really important because it means that they can engage in a much deeper understanding of what the consumer wants, and maybe the digital part of the business becomes incremental rather than detracting from their growth. The second thing is the new business models, and we've talked about that. I mean, digital channels and commerce digitally have grown so much significantly, as we said earlier. And I think we need to think differently about it. It is no longer a transactional site. When you think about how your brand shows up online, in some cases, this is the only way you're going to be able to build your brand equity. In some cases, this is the relationship you're going to have with the consumer. So when you think about, digital commerce, for example, think about it as a way of building your brand into the future, not just of increasing sales in the short term. This, in some cases, will become your main brand building channel into the future. And then lastly, is thinking about the operating model. We've seen lots of people change the organizational structure and maybe put a chief experience officer in place, or put commerce into marketing. Ultimately, this is about collaboration and about reinventing maybe the process that ties it all together at pace, enable empower teams, maybe cross-functional teams. There isn't one way to do it. Some people have reorganized around maybe demand spaces or occasions or the type of consumer or the type of service. Just think about it, but cross-functionality is absolutely critical. The old models of past are no longer fit for the future. And I'm just going to end with talking about one of our case studies, in this case, Eli Cafe. Italian brand goes global, wants to make sure that it's transforming the experience they provide to their customers globally, because obviously coffee is always an experience. And particularly if you live in Italy, actually you go from one coffee to the next, I think. So what they've done is reconfigured what the Eli experience looks like, and they've tied in all their channels internally and externally, wanting to make sure that the content they put out there, even through the commerce channels, is the right content, as I said earlier. And they are now on a mission to transform the whole experience globally, working quite closely with them. And with that, I think I'm going to stop talking, because I think it's enough of one person talking at length. And I think I'm going to be handing over to Helen again about 4 questions.
Thank you so much, Nevine. It was fantastic, very inspirational as well. Yes, we have some questions for you regarding, let me check, regarding the hang on a second, we have more new questions. Okay, I'll ask you this one later. First of all, regarding the social consumer journey, how do you suggest a brand start this social consumer journey?
Well, creating one or understanding the current one. I think the social consumer journey is an interesting one, because I think in the past, the path to purchase, if you want, was linear. Traditionally we went from this awareness to consideration, and it was a bit of a funnel, and then hopefully you buy, you like it, and you come back and become a loyal consumer. The world is no longer like that, and I think it's sort of the journey is all over the place. It's fluid, and the way to do it is to look at multiple sources of data and try and link the behavior of the consumer online across multiple categories, actually, because we make the mistake of thinking that, an Eli Cafe consumer is just an Eli Cafe consumer, or they consume all sorts of brands. So just understanding people in their entirety and their behavior through mapping their social footprint is quite important. And through that, we can try and understand how they're currently behaving, and then design for it.
Okay. You also talked about the importance of the dialogue with the consumer, what the company has to show what it does. But what about what the company doesn't do? Is it equally important?
Yes, I think it's critically important. I'm going to go back to the research I talked about at the beginning. I think I said that people will reconsider their purpose and their different purchase motivations. One of the things we found is that price and quality have always been table stakes, but they're becoming much more less important in terms of how people make choices about brands and services. And the things that have become much more important are around personal care, product origin, things like trust and reputation. So the way a company behaves and what it does and it doesn't do is becoming a genuine choice differentiator for brands and services. So people are voting with their wallet, and they're choosing companies that are behaving in the way that they want them to behave, that fit with their own values.
Good. In this sense, the next question asks, are companies supposed to serve as role models in human rights, sustainability, political views, etc.?
Oh, it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure there is one answer for it. Every company decides who their consumers or customers are. Yeah, you say, right, this is what I offer, this is what I stand for, and these are the types of consumers I want to appeal to. And you need to be able to marry your own behavior and your own set of values to the consumer. If you're selling, anything really, and your consumer really cares about how you behave in that space, then I think you need to take a position, but be transparent about it. So I just think the world has become so much smaller that it's difficult for companies not to be open and transparent about what they're doing and what they stand for. Whether they take a view on societal movements, for example, is a bit questionable. Personally, my personal view is that they should.
Okay, yeah, I have to agree with you, Nevine. But your view is more important, of course. They also ask you from the University Rey Juan Carlos, King Juan Carlos, how does the consumers change in a digital entorno digital and in a digital ecosystem or
How the consumer change? How does their behavior change?
I guess.
I think that, again, I'm going to go back to the original research that I talked about. What we found is that convenience has become much, much more important. So because people have reevaluated their own purpose, they have said, I don't want to spend my time and my life shopping now. So the way they want almost like, one click shop. They want the information available. They want transparency. They don't want to have to search for stuff. So I think the behavior changes in the sense that convenience has become extremely important. And I think the values and the way you come across within that is become even more important in the past. In the past, digital commerce was used for convenience, obviously, but also for price comparison. So a lot of people, we work with Best Buy in the US, and they were like the shop front for Amazon. So people would go into the store, they look at the stuff, they touch it, they play with it, and then they go and buy it off Amazon cheaper. And that needs to stop. So people behave now differently online. It's become much more of an integrated experience rather than just a best price and convenience equation.
Excellent. The word experience comes up all the time. They also ask you, you've given us examples of brands and examples that have worked and are doing well. What about other examples of brands that have got this all wrong? So we can learn a bit. Maybe you rather keep that for yourself.
Yes, I think if you don't mind that, it's difficult
all right.
to finger. I'm not sure anybody gets it 100% right. So
Yeah, it was more, I guess, from the purpose of learning than anything else. All right, there's another question regarding you. You have to vision of the future. In what ways will the digital consumer be different in 10 years' time? Let's say 5.
I don't think 10 years is doable anymore. When I was a brand manager a very long time ago, we used to do 10-year strategies. We don't anymore. I don't think anybody does.
But I guess from now to the future, in the coming years, of course, you said at the beginning there is no way back.
Yes.
This is obviously a trend.
I think two things. I think the experience remains critical. It needs to be relevant. And I think the boundaries between the physical and the digital will blur completely. So you will interact with the brand physically and digitally in a very seamless way. And the experience will be much more holistic in nature. And I think whether you actually press the purchase button online or in store won't matter, because the relationship you will have with that brand or service will be so deep and meaningful if you choose to have that relationship, that it'll be much more experiential and potentially even more personalized.
Excellent. What a good word. Personalized. A few of the words that you've repeated or you mentioned that came up this morning, and I'm sure will come up during the whole week, are trust, purpose, authenticity, and now personalization. Fantastic keynote, Nevine. I want to thank you, Nevine El-Warraky, for joining us from London, from Accenture Interactive, to finish this morning and to remind us that there's no way back. There's a lot of work to be done, but there's a lot of tools, and the future is bright. It's exciting. At least there's, for sure, from Accenture Interactive, you are having a fun time.
Having a good. Yes. Thank you very much for having. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday. We say goodbye to Nevine El-Warraky. All our love to the UK, to London.